Welcome back to our third lecture. This lecture is somewhat difficult in terms of the concepts involved, but close attention and research really will pay dividends. We'll be talking about what has been termed the Bayesian brain. And to introduce a rather stunning example of what our brain does against our best intuition, I will show a video. You may be able to see the URL superimposed on the image here. So you have now watched the video and you have noticed in this hollow face illusion that despite your best intention and your best efforts to see the hollow face, your brain is preventing you from implementing the image in your mind. Why is that? Well, we all know that faces stick out. Noses don't go inside, noses come outside, and the contours of the face are going into the world rather than away from the world. This notion, this experience, this conviction is encoded in the brain and reinforced by millions of times of watching faces and seeing faces. It's cemented into our neurons and hardwired. In Bayesian terms, this is a so-called prior, something that's already there before you gather new experiences. Okay, the Bayesian brain. Bayes was a gentleman in the 1700s who came up with a new way of statistical thinking. And in the first slide, we summarize some of these thoughts. For many decades, neuroscientists have understood the brain as a stimulus response organ. So visual images come into your retina, photons bombard your retina. These are transduced by the appropriate pigment and cells in the retina, and the images then are transcoded and encoded and relayed into the visual cortex, going through V1, V2, etc., until the image is somehow recomposed and represented in your, quote, mind's eye, close quote. An immediate problem arises here because of something called bandwidth. You accumulate a tremendous amount of sensory input every second of your waking life. Visual stimuli, auditory stimuli, tactile stimuli, olfactory stimuli, and proprioceptive perception as to where you are in space, where your body is located, and so on and so forth. So this can't go on because even our 100 billion neurons may be overwhelmed in dealing with this kind of dense data set. So the brain, in a sense, has copied something that has been reinvented by man in signal processing. For example, video images can be compressed. Same is true for audio files. You don't hear the entire full spectrum audio file. It's edited in such a way that the nearest neighbor of the data point that you want to emphasize is guessed at. Most likely it will be very closely related to the point that you want to encode. So all you have to really collect is an error term. How far away is the pixel from the central pixel that I want to deal with? And error terms, of course, are much less intensive in terms of coding, and you can save a tremendous amount of bandwidth. Now, of course, the brain didn't copy man, but evolution has come up with a way, it appears, to optimize our bandwidth utilization. So this is where Bayesian approaches come in, specifically in terms of estimating the error terms of the expectation that we had. So in the example of the hollow face image, the error term got totally overwhelmed by what we call the prior. You may have noticed a stunned sensation or a creepy feeling as the face was rotating, and you expected to look inside the hollow face, but then your brain corrected you and turned the face inside out. And this eerie feeling is the collision of your prior expectation with error terms that your brain was computing and trying to reconcile with what you were seeing. And this collision is experienced in an emotional sense of surprise. In the next slide, I point out that it has been argued that brains are essentially prediction machines. We are bundles of cells that support perception and action by constantly attempting to match incoming sensory input with top-down expectation and prediction. And this is achieved using hierarchical generative models that aim to minimize prediction error within a bidirectional cascade of cortical processing. So in other words, rather than data from the world coming in raw format and being processed by your unexpecting brain, your brain already has collected notions as to how things should be, what to expect. You have a vast set of experiences that you can fall back on in interpreting new sensory data as they come in. So, all you have to do is compare your expectations with the data set coming in, compute the error terms, and hopefully the error is not too great as it was in the hollow face illusion, and you're in business. The next slide confronts you with the problem that the brain has. The brain really has an impossible job if you think about it. It's in the skull, it's dark inside. The brain does not have any direct access to the world, but rather all it knows is its own digital responses to sensory stimuli that have come in over time. It doesn't know the outside world. All it knows is its own reverberation in response to input from the outside world. So perception in the Bayesian sense involves explaining away sensory signals by matching it with predictions that are generated within the brain. So perception, therefore, is not neutral, but it's loaded up with pre-existing theories. What we perceived depends heavily upon the set of priors. again using the Bayesian term, including hyperpriors, we will get into this a little later, that the brain brings to bear in its attempt to predict the current sensory signal. The next slide. We want to dive right into something that might be very practical for psychiatrists, and that is the unexplained fact that we do have a dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia and psychosis. We know that amphetamine will flood the brain with dopamine, and we know that that is related to the production of psychotic symptoms such as delusions and hallucinations. Well, hallucinations can be rather short-lived and may respond quickly to antipsychotic medication, which block dopamine receptors. So the dopamine story is cohesive and makes a lot of sense. Too much dopamine, hallucinations, blocking dopamine receptors with antipsychotic drugs, attenuating the hallucinations. Why then are delusions so long-lived and often so difficult to treat? So here's a group of folks that have used a Bayesian approach to try to understand why this should be. In this slide, you see the typical Bayesian formula that talks about the probability P H/D of a hypothesis being true given a certain data set coming in. That is the prior probability before the data were observed. And then on the other side of the equation, we have a product of the prior probability and the likelihood of your hypothesis being accurate given the data set. Now that's a mouthful and that's a lot to think about, but I think it will become clearer as we go along. So this is the basic Bayesian probability equation. And in the next set we see an application that these researchers have created. On the right hand side of the slide here you see the hollow face illusion, and right underneath is the so-called Necker tube, which is a cube that you can either see in one way or the other. The sides coming at you or going away from you, but you cannot see both at the same time. It's a bistable or unstable image that will flip back and forth. So here you see a theory as to how prediction errors and priors interact and how this might map onto neurotransmitters. So NMDA is here listed as being in the prediction error business, and glutamate and GABA present the error term, and these terms interact, and what this does in the brain itself then is produce synaptic changes and change the neuronal dynamics. So here's an attempt then to map the creation of long-term delusional beliefs onto changes, also long-term, in neuronal circuitry involving glutamate, GABA, and NMDA. This was inspired by the fact that ketamine, an NMDA receptor antagonist, is known to be able to cause delusions and hallucinations after short-term as well as long-term administration. I refer you to this interesting paper, which is available as a clickable item in the ebook as well. In the next slide, we see another way of phrasing this. You can see that the putative effects of acute and chronic ketamine administration within the Bayesian model creates a loop that goes around from learning to prediction errors to priors over and over again until the circuitry has been changed and is no longer able to respond to new information. Learning and updating your beliefs is an essential task of the brain, and it requires certain neuronal circuitry, which, when interfered with, may lead to the crystallization and solidification of beliefs, and you're frozen in a state of mind that's no longer accessible to correction by new data coming in. Now, we mentioned dopamine, and in recent times, the effects of dopamine have been presented as one possible neural mechanism for encoding the precision of neurons, which refer the reader to the work on prediction error and the mesolimbic dopaminergic system. So dopamine is in the business of error detection, and there's an entire literature in neuroeconomics which utilizes these models, and we will later on get into this business as well, because very powerful heuristic models can be derived from neuroeconomics and its view on dopamine in the context of the Bayesian brain. Here's an example of what dopamine actually does. So this is a recording of an individual dopamine neuron in response to the monkey receiving a treat, some fruit juice, which monkeys are very fond of. And this treat is linked now to a conditioned stimulus, such as a bell or another sound. And you can see that the dopamine firing rate immediately after the reward increases in the top panel. In the middle panel, you can see that there is a conditioned stimulus marked as CS preceding the dispensing of the juice, and the juice is dispensed, and you can see the dopamine neurons are very happy and firing at a dramatically increased rate. So this now encodes the experience and the prediction of reward. Now, what happens if the monkey does not receive a reward, although the prediction has been made? In the bottom panel, you can see that on the right-hand side, that the firing rate of the dopamine neuron is dropping out dramatically. So this can be quantified to exquisite degrees and has been used in neuroeconomics to predict preferences, choices, and other things with mathematical accuracy, actually. In the next slide, I refer you to a paper by Andy Clark, University of Edinburgh, who has done a great job in summarizing the recent thinking of the Bayesian brain, and has done a remarkable job to such an extent that a whole bunch of discussants have been invited to take his paper apart and amplify on it. This paper is also included as a clickable item in the ebook, and you can look at it at your leisure. So here's a paper from Science, 2003. Wolfram Schultz is really the godfather of dopamine and neuroeconomics. And the headline says, "Discrete coding of reward probability and uncertainty by dopamine neurons." So the additional term appearing now is uncertainty. Our brains are confronted with an environment that has a great deal of predictable features, but is profoundly unpredictable. Things happen all the time coming out of left field, and certainty and uncertainty of beliefs and convictions are encoded in the brain by the activity of dopamine neurons, and again are subject to Bayesian statistics as well. Sensory motor learning, for example, playing tennis, is a typical example of a Bayesian activity, but perhaps a simpler setup is this one. Subjects here were asked to kind of track with their finger across a plane and approach a stimulus. However, to approach a target, however, the experimenters have monkeyed around with the target and moved it sideways, unbeknownst to the subject. And you can see that when feedback is given, the subject will attempt to approach the target, but it will always veer to the incorrectly announced location rather than the true location. This has been studied more extensively, and you can see that when you model Bayesian statistics onto the outcome of these movements, they fit perfectly well. So this is then taken as evidence that the integration of vision and movement, for example, follows Bayesian statistics very, very well. Here's again a correction of the prior probability distribution superimposed on the movement as they are actually happening. So, what should the nervous system actually do? Well, it should make decisions. So, take this experiment, for example. This is throwing darts. If you were the perfect dart thrower, you would get a 20 every single time, but you have motor instability, problems with your visual motor integration, and on the right-hand side you can see that there's a certain distribution of where your dart will land. This also can be modeled very precisely with Bayesian statistics. And in the next slide, another decision-making adventure here. This is a game of tennis. Your opponent will shoot the ball across the net. You have prior experience where he usually places his ball with his forehand, and that's the so-called prior here outlined in green. And you also observe the trajectory of the ball as it is approaching you, and you integrate those two notions, the prior experience and the trajectory as it occurs in real time, into the most likely situation as to where you should place your racket. Again, a Bayesian statistic par excellence. Here is a breakdown in terms of time. You can see that we have a belief as to where the ball might be landing. Now all kinds of dynamics come into place, including observations that you make of his tennis stroke, the trajectory of the ball, as well as your prior experience with his opponent, and you make an inference as to what the best strategy might be. Okay, so this is a quick overview over some of the concepts and applications of Bayesian statistics. We just have scratched the surface, and there is a lot more, and certainly we need to dig a great deal deeper to understand the neuronal implementation of this. Interestingly, as it turns out, infants younger than a year of age can already use Bayesian reasoning, and their perception and decision-making prowess can be modeled very exactly with Bayesian approaches. This is one of the themes we will be discussing in the next video lectures, entitled Applications and Neuronal Foundations of the Bayesian Brain. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.